In 40 years of financial practice, I have sat with people at every stage of adult life. People in their 20s who had nothing and were beginning. People in their 40s navigating the accumulation years with all of the competing demands those years impose. People in their 60s reviewing what had been built and deciding how to use it. And across all of those conversations, across all of those stages, there is one observation that I have never found a clean way to communicate until the person is already inside it and can feel it themselves. The observation is that the final decade before retirement is not simply the last chapter of the accumulation story. It is a different kind of financial time altogether, qualitatively different, not just later in the sequence. And the people who understand this difference while they are living through it produce outcomes that are not marginally better than the people who do not. They are structurally different in ways that determine the financial character of the following 20 or 30 years of retirement. My name is Richard Harlow, and what I want to do today is describe precisely what makes the final decade different, why that difference compounds so dramatically, and how the specific decisions available during those 10 years, decisions that are not available with the same power at any other point in adult financial life, determine not just how much someone retires with, but what kind of financial life they are able to live once the labor income stops. The first thing that makes the final decade qualitatively different is what I call the convergence of advantages. At no other point in a working life do as many favorable conditions simultaneously exist. Income is typically at or very near its career peak. The accumulated professional expertise, seniority, and reputation that take decades to build are now priced in by the market, and the earning capacity of the final decade in most professional careers is meaningfully higher than any earlier decade. The competing demands on that income have simultaneously reduced. Children are financially independent, or nearly so. Housing costs are stable or reduced because mortgages are advanced or paid off. The social and lifestyle experimentation that consumes capital in earlier decades has settled into known preferences that cost less to maintain than the discovery process that preceded them. Career development costs, the professional education, the networking events, the tools of career advancement, are lower in the final decade because the career is already advanced. The result of this convergence is a capital efficiency rate, the proportion of earned income genuinely available for strategic deployment toward building financial structure, that is higher during the final decade than it has been at any previous point and will never be as high again. The final decade is, for most people who live it with financial awareness, the period of maximum available capital per year of remaining time. That combination does not appear at any other moment. I want to tell you about a man named Bartholomew. Bartholomew was 53 years old when I first worked with him, a civil engineer with a career that had built steadily and reliably for 30 years, producing an income in the final decade that was nearly double what it had been in his early career. He came to me with a genuine and thoughtful question. He knew he had 10 to 12 years until he wanted to retire. He believed he had not fully used the earlier decades as well as he might have, and he wanted to understand whether 10 years was enough to matter, or whether the outcome was already substantially determined by what had and had not been done before. His question was, in essence, whether the final decade was a meaningful opportunity or primarily a maintenance period for a trajectory already set. The answer, which we worked through together with his specific numbers, was striking in its clarity. What Bartholomew's income in the final decade could produce, directed deliberately toward income-generating assets rather than consumed by lifestyle expansion, was not a supplement to the earlier decades of accumulation. It was, in absolute dollar terms, at the rates his current income and a sustainable high savings rate could generate, comparable in its projected outcome to the entirety of what the prior 30 years had produced. Not because the earlier decades had been negligent, they had not. Because the combination of peak income, dramatically reduced competing demands, and 10 years of compounding from a large base creates a mathematical reality that most people have never computed for their specific situation. The final decade, used with intention, can produce as much financial structure as all the prior decades combined. Not always, not in every situation, but with enough regularity that the statement is not hyperbole. It is arithmetic. The second dimension of the final decade's unique character is the quality of financial decision-making available during it. A person at 54 has something that a person at 34 categorically does not have: the accumulated experiential knowledge that comes from having actually navigated 2 or 3 full market cycles with money at stake. They have learned, not from books or projections, but from the visceral experience of watching their own portfolio lose 30% in a correction and managing the impulse to sell at exactly the wrong moment. They have learned from having bought financial products that perform differently from how they were explained at the point of sale. They have learned from having carried debt through a period of reduced income and understanding in their bones what financial fragility actually feels like. This experiential knowledge, translated into decision-making behavior, produces a measurable improvement in outcomes that compound across 10 years. Fewer catastrophic errors at the worst moments, more accurate calibration of risk tolerance, more consistent follow-through on strategies that have been chosen with genuine conviction, rather than with the speculative confidence of someone who has not yet been tested. The final decade is when this accumulated wisdom is most valuable and most fully available, applied to the period of maximum capital and maximum time sensitivity. The third dimension is what I think of as the clarity dividend. By the time someone reaches their mid-50s, the discovery phase of adult life, the phase in which a significant portion of spending goes toward learning what you actually want, what kind of life genuinely produces satisfaction, rather than its appearance, is largely complete. Preferences are known. Values are clear. What you actually need to live the life that will satisfy you in retirement is a knowable thing, rather than a speculation. This clarity is financially valuable in 2 specific ways. It eliminates the exploratory spending that characterizes the earlier decades, the lifestyle experiments, the aspirational purchases, the social spending calibrated to a peer group whose values may have been adopted unreflectingly. And it makes the retirement income target genuinely computable, not as a theoretical projection based on standard assumptions, but as a specific, personally accurate number derived from real knowledge of what a satisfying life actually costs. Knowing precisely what you are building toward, rather than building toward a vague number that represents some combination of financial security anxiety and aspirational lifestyle, produces a completely different quality of decision-making about what to prioritize in the final decade. Bartholomew and I spent the 3 months after our initial meeting building what I call a decade deployment plan, a specific, sequenced strategy for how each year of the final decade would use the convergence of peak income, reduced competing demands, and clear priorities to construct the financial structure his retirement would require. The plan was not complicated. It was methodical. A savings rate set at the maximum honestly sustainable given his actual expense structure, automated on the first of each month before any competing demand had a chance to claim the available capital. An investment structure divided between a growth component oriented toward continued compounding and an income component that began immediately building the dividend-paying portfolio that would eventually generate the retirement income without requiring the sale of any principal. A deliberate holding of the lifestyle at its current level despite income that continued to rise, capturing each increment of income growth for the investment structure, rather than allowing it to fund the lifestyle expansion that would have felt natural and was, in the context of a decade with so much at stake, financially costly. 5 years into that plan, Bartholomew's financial trajectory had shifted in ways he described, at our most recent annual review, as more significant than everything that had happened in the prior 30 years combined. Not because the individual decisions had been remarkable, because the convergence of the right conditions had finally been met with the right intentionality at the same moment. He had always been capable of the decisions. The conditions for the decisions to produce their maximum effect had simply never previously existed in the combination that the final decade created. I want to leave you with a specific and direct question to sit with between now and your next financial conversation. Not a calculation, not a task. A question that is worth holding. If you are in the final decade before retirement right now, do you have a plan for this decade that is specific to it, that uses the particular characteristics of this period, its peak income, its reduced demands, its clarity of preference? Or do you have a continuation of what has been happening for the prior decades, extended forward without modification for the different and more powerful moment you are currently living through? The answer to that question tells you whether you are using the decade or simply occupying it. Using it produces something different than occupying it. The difference is the work this conversation is pointing toward.